working our way through domain and ranges and looking at specific functions. We did a linear function, talked about domain and range. We did a quadratic function, talked about domain and range. We're going to look at a radical function. A radical all means is we're dealing with a square root. Again, these are all functions. We'll look more in depth at other parts, other times. But right now, I just want to really get into this idea of domain is all the possible input values for a function. So it's a way of describing what can we put in for x. And the range is all the possible output values we can get back for y. So I'm putting values in for x, I'm getting results back for y, showing my relationship. Domain and range just helps me describe particular characteristics of a function. All right, so let's take a look at this function. This is another interesting one. Here, if you can look at the graph, my graph seems to just start out of nowhere right here at this point, x value of 3. And then it goes on to the right. I plotted some points there. In particular, it doesn't have any, there's these particular x values where it doesn't seem to work, right? If we did on our calculator, let's take a look at an x value of 1. I've left it blank here for a reason on why, but let's take a look at my equation, what happens if I put 1 in. So if I make x 1, I've got the square root of 1 minus 3. And that's going to be 1 minus 3 is negative 2, so the square root of negative 2. And if I try to calculate that, the square root of negative 2, if I use a calculator, I'll get something like an error or undefined. And what my calculator is telling me is that the square root of negative 2, that's not a real number. It's actually an imaginary number. We'll get to that much later on at this time when we get into square roots and quadratic stuff later. But for now, I can just realize that undefined, I'm going to put UNDF for undefined just for now. That's a place, that's an x value that doesn't work for this function. I put it in and I can't get a y value back. Same thing with 2. If I put 2 in for x, what's the square root of 2 minus 3? Well, that equals the square root of negative 1. That's also not a real number, so it's undefined. So right there, I've got on my table 2 particular values that don't work. But what I actually see is there's all these x values. If I look at the graph, it only starts working right here when x value of 3. Because that's the only x value that I can put in where I start to get positive numbers. 3 minus 3 is 0. I can take the square root of 0. And I can take the square root of positive numbers. I just can't square root negative numbers. So what we see is that this function does not work for all these x values because they cause my function to be negative under the square root and to not work. I can't get a y value back. So if I want to describe the domain of this function would be all x values or real numbers, all x values greater than or equal to 3. It doesn't work for anything else. So those are the only x values that I can put in and get a y value back. It has to be 3 or greater than 3. Okay, but there's some limitations to my y values as well too. If I'm looking at my y values, the first y value I get is 0 and then everything seems to get bigger. I look at my graph and I don't have any negative y values. And in particular, if x has to be 3 or greater, and I'm going to get a positive number into the square root, well, the square root of a positive number always stays positive. So I'm thinking if I combine all my information here, my range is all positive y values. Actually, there's a better way. It's not all positive y values because it could be 0 too. So let me strike that. we'll say all y values greater than or equal to, I'm going to use some inequality here as this shorter, all y values greater than or equal to 0. That would be the range of this function. So now this is a function where I've got a limitation on x values and I've got a limitation on y values. There's a smaller window of x and y values that work. So all the x values greater than or equal to 3 is the domain of this particular radical function. And the range is all the possible y values greater than or equal to 0. Hopefully that is helping you get an idea about domain and range and how we use it to describe functions.